Now, turbulence has once again led to air passengers being hospitalised, this time on a flight from Doha to Dublin. 12 people were injured, with 8 passengers taken to hospital when their plane experienced turbulence over Turkey around 2 hours into the flight. And the aircraft was met by emergency services when it landed at Dublin Airport at lunchtime yesterday. Some passengers told reporters what happened.
It was very scary. It was the worst experience, honestly, on an airplane. I've been flying back and forth for years, and it was really scary.
I guess an hour or 2 hours away from Dublin Airport, and essentially hit a pocket of turbulence where we dropped for about 5 seconds. You could see people hit the roof, food and things everywhere, and a few injuries from that, so it was a bit confronting.
And then obviously it was like seatbelts on, there was panic, the look of panic everywhere. Some of the flight attendants I saw, they had like scratches on their face, they had ice to their face. There was one girl that had a sling on her arm.
Next minute, whoa, dinner came off my lap. Just food all over the plane, on the ceiling, everywhere. So yeah, it was just atrocious.
This news comes just days after a flight heading to Singapore encountered such extreme turbulence that a man died and 71 passengers were wounded. 6 of those were reported to be in a critical condition. Joining us now is Eoghan Corry, travel journalist and editor of Travel Extra magazine. Eoghan, how often does this kind of extreme turbulence happen? Are we hearing about it more because of the Singapore Airlines flight, or is this unusual?
Good morning, Eve. It's quite unusual to have that number of injuries. The number of injuries totally around the world last year, serious injuries, was 21 from turbulence. Nothing new about turbulence. A lot of listeners would know exactly what happens. The captain says we're coming into an area of turbulence. Everyone belts up. Once everyone has got their seatbelt on, everything is safe. But what happened in these 2 separate incidents is that it was timed badly. There wasn't any forewarning. It was during mealtime in both cases. Neither of them dropped a huge distance. Sometimes you can drop 1,000 feet. I think in the Singapore incidents, it was 300 feet. But it happened repeatedly, being trashed around like a washing machine in Dublin Airport. The Doha to Dublin flight, it happened over Turkey. It was about 30 feet. But again, it was the lack of warning. And that's really what the aviation industry will be looking at, Eve. Their big conference is in Dubai next week. I'll be flying out to attend that. I expect turbulence to be all over the discussion.
And so is it a case of can pilots be more aware, or is this is how you have to deal with it? Once you get into it, you have no warning?
For years, it was sort of every airline managed their own, and there wasn't much sharing of data. Just before pandemic, in January 2020, there was a system launched where airlines would share data. Aer Lingus was one of the pioneers in that, and Qatar are a participant. There's only about 25 airlines in that sharing of data app or system at the moment, and it feeds also from the ground stations. That could be a problem in the Singapore instance when they were flying over Myanmar. But it really needs more airlines participating, less subjective. An experienced pilot would be better at spotting turbulence. Clear air turbulence can't be seen at all, but some of the other leeway turbulence can be experienced. So the feeding of information, the processing of information, the speed at which information is processed, they are all the things aviation be looking at, because as I said, there's no real reason to fear if you're belted up, but it's when you run into it unexpectedly that accidents like we've seen in the last week have happened.
And what can airlines do to reassure people? Because we heard there people coming off that flight had a very scary experience. There was a man coming off that Singapore Airlines flight that wouldn't travel onward to his own son's wedding because it would have required so many extra flights. So you're essentially creating people who now have maybe a phobia of flying. What can you do as an airline to try and address that?
You actually can't say you won't run into unexpected turbulence. So little is known about it, even after all these years. Airlines sometimes dismiss the level of fear and anxiety. Around 10% of people are anxious about flying in the first place. So this is not the sort of news that they need. I would expect out of this more severe restrictions. They will be inconvenient for passengers. I do expect more restrictions on belting up. I know Singapore have tightened up their seatbelt regulations since last week's incident and are avoiding tropical storm areas like they came over Myanmar. So we'll probably see that through the aviation industry. If you're anxious about flying, the one thing you've got to remember is turbulence will have no effect on you if you're belted up. If the dinner lands in your lap, it's not the worst thing in the world.
And I saw Singapore Airlines have decided that they're not going to serve hot food or drinks when the seatbelt sign is on. So that's already a more cautious approach.
I would expect that to be replicated by other airlines. It already costs, I mean, let's look at what, from the airline's perspective, passenger comfort is a big deal, but their own staff, they have to assure their staff when they go to work in the morning, they're not going to be injured and it's the staff in both cases were on their feet. It also costs the money. It costs between €250,000 and €2 million a year in airline, the turbulence issue, and it has fuel issues. There's all sorts of economic implications for those who look at the bottom line, the guys and the accountants. But the real issue here now is that aviation has a credibility problem already out of the Boeing incidents, and it now has to reassure its passengers that it's doing something about turbulence, and there's nothing you can do about preventing it, but you can certainly need the sort of technological advancement we've seen that has been seen in air safety and other areas. We need that heavy rigour being applied to predicting turbulence so that we don't run into it unexpectedly on long-haul flights.
I had family who were flying over the weekend, and my husband said to them, just keep your seatbelts on the whole time. Is that good advice?
Your husband's a good man. That's a very strong advice.
I'll be delighted to hear it.
I've read through thousands of pages of scientific papers about turbulence, but that pretty much sums it up.
Right, okay. So keep your seatbelt on. Maybe don't have a scalding cup of hot coffee in your hand if you can avoid it.
That's exactly the advice. I mean, the hot food issue is already, on ground services. I noticed some of the major train lines across Europe have moved completely away from hot food because of spillages. And, out of the Singapore incident, the lawyers in Australia are circling. They're talking about big lawsuits. Not much you can do if you're an airline about predicting turbulence, but the management of the incident, which I thought Singapore did quite well and Qatar did quite well, and the reassurance of passengers that nothing unexpected. The last thing you need if people are already anxious about flying is the possibility of something unexpected happening on that flight. As I say, belted up, I've flown some of the most turbulent routes in the world, one of them from Santiago to Ushuaia across the Andes is regarded as the worst. A lot of tossing around on the route, but there was no way anybody was releasing a seatbelt from takeoff to landing.
Okay. Thank you so much, Eoghan, for joining us this morning. That's about that flight from Doha to Dublin, which experienced some turbulence. Qatar Airways say that flight landed safely. A small number of passengers and crew sustained minor injuries and are receiving medical attention. It's now subject to internal investigation. They said the safety and security of passengers and crew are a top priority.